this will all work. This meeting is being live streamed. Okay. All right. So anybody that does not have their video going will not be visible to the YouTube audience, but anything you say can and will be held against you.
Or supported indelibly.
Or supported forever. I was very pleased to see that even without Jordan, over the weekend, my Sunday session ended up with 235 views so far. Since
That's wonderful.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it is. Especially at that hour.
Yeah. And yeah, so I mean, that wasn't how many people were listening at that hour, but
right. But since
that's
then,
how many people who have connected to it since then, which is quite a bunch of people.
That's a solid feat.
Yeah, especially since I guess I gave a mini homily about religion in general, and it was purely off the cuff, or almost all off the cuff. I did read a couple of things, but people seem to like those things. And
I like the way you penned it as renewal. And I said the phoenixing, and they're like, exactly, renewal. It's where we need to be.
Right. And so, Nick, do you want to start us off? We're going to talk about the personal and the collective unconscious today. Good evening, Art. Nice to see you. We had a great Thanksgiving. I hope you did too.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in here.
Yep.
I think I might tackle the first two paragraphs since they're just a little bit shorter here.
Okay.
So, all right, from the top, the transpersonal and the collective, the personal and the collective or transpersonal unconscious. At this point, a new stage in our process of realization begins. We carried the analysis of infantile transference fantasies to the point where it became sufficiently clear, even to the patient, that he was making the doctor his father, mother, uncle, guardian, and teacher, and all the rest of the parental authorities. But, as experience has repeatedly shown, still other fantasies appear which represent the doctor as a savior or godlike being, naturally in complete contradiction to healthy conscious reasoning. Moreover, it transpires that these godlike attributes go far beyond the framework of Christianity in which we have grown up. They take on a pagan glamour and indeed very often appear in an animal form. The transference is in itself no more than a projection of unconscious contents. At first, the so-called superficial contents of the unconscious are projected, as can be seen from symptoms, dreams, and fantasies. In this state, the young doctor is interesting as a possible lover, rather like the young Italian in the case we were discussing. Then he appears more in the role of the father, either the good, kind father or the thunderer, depending on the qualities which the real father had for the patient. Sometimes the doctor has a maternal significance, a fact that seems somewhat peculiar, but is still within the bounds of possibility. All these fantasy projections are founded on personal memories.
Why don't you go on finally?
Okay. Finally, there appear forms of fantasy that possess an extravagant character. The doctor is then endowed with uncanny powers. He is a magician or a wicked demon, or else the corresponding personification of goodness, a savior. Again, he may appear as a mixture of both. Of course, it is to be understood that he need not necessarily appear like this to the patient's conscious mind. It is only the fantasies coming to the surface which picture him in this guise. Such patients often cannot get it into their heads that their fantasies really come from themselves and have little or nothing to do with the character of the doctor. This delusion rests on the fact that there are no personal grounds in the memory for this kind of projection. It can sometimes be shown that similar fantasies had, at a certain period in childhood, attached themselves to the father or mother, although neither father nor mother provided any real occasion for them.
Okay. Comments?
Yeah, the thing that I kind of find myself wondering, which is in the form of a question more so than any kind of comment, I certainly don't have any insight on this front, but I wonder if this is the case specific to people who are unwell or perhaps disordered in some sense. Because I'm just reading this and thinking, where can I look for an example of this? And it's kind of difficult to think into regular life where might something like this be popping up.
Didn't you ever fall in love with your kindergarten teacher?
I asked mine to marry me. I actually asked her to stop aging so I could catch up. Her boyfriend would be gone by then and I could marry her.
No,
Nick, that's a great point.
I think I catch the drift, Skip, and I can look for some potential examples around that time in my life. I had a somewhat unique situation. I grew up, my grandmother was a teacher at the elementary school that I attended, so I knew all of the teachers, and it was none of them were particularly never mind what I'm going to say. Never mind.
They weren't your type, so to speak.
They weren't quite young enough, but often kindergarten teachers are young women in their early to mid 20s, I think. And often they don't have children of their own yet. And so they project something on the children in the class, I think, and the children project back. I know I was in love with Mrs. Brown, Miss Brown, my kindergarten teacher, very clearly, no doubt. I still remember her name. And this was on the Mojave Desert, believe it or not.
But even still, I find myself wondering if that's not something a little more personal. I'm wondering more about, because what do
you mean more personal?
Well, it seems like it's going to come to the fore in the following paragraphs, but it seems like he's drawing a distinction between the personal unconscious and what we might project about our own parents or idealized parents onto teachers or anything like that, and then going into the transpersonal unconscious and projecting all of these strange archaic images onto people, whether they be pagan or animalistic or any such thing.
Well, Nick, I think it's a great observation in terms of what are examples, and not necessarily, I think I would generalize back to the psychological state you're driving at, not necessarily ill, because I've had plenty of clients who have been through plenty of counseling and they've gotten over the mother father things, but they have what I call low-key echoes, where they're still basically battling themselves and undermining themselves as a parent, saying no in a way. And I say low-key echoes because the parent never did that to them. And so it's their habit that basically became naturalized in a way, which rather than an illness, it seems to be a second phase healing that I've seen plenty of examples of, where when someone says something, it's usually when they say should or ought. I always ask, well, or what your mom or what mentor, tormentor are you processing? And I just stop, and it usually becomes pretty clear. And so rather than ill, I think you made a good point though, with that, the examples of that, although neither father nor mother provided any real occasions for them, is a really important last statement in paragraph 99, because then that's a self-created piece.
I think it's also interesting too that I could be way off base on this, but I think there might be kind of a difference in perspective in the time when Jung was working, because it seems like, particularly in this book, every case that he's talked about is not somebody who's necessarily looking for self-development or self-improvement or anything that he's working with. It's someone who's genuinely unwell that's seeking it. And whereas now it might be more of a case of, somebody's kind of curious about individuation or something like that, and maybe not to the point of complete disorder and maybe absolute ruin if they don't seek out help from someone.
And also, I think it's easier to mine the gold out of someone who's really, really seriously ill, because it's evident and it's obvious and it's intense. And I think that's where he gets a lot of the gold mine, in his work, is that he's seeing the psyche so clearly because it's unfiltered in a way.
Yes, to second that, I think in the latter example is the case where one might see this kind of thing more so than just in perhaps regular life. So maybe I'm looking for an example where one is not to be found. I don't know.
Well, let's read some more here, and then
I don't have, from, for example, his level of, actually, Marilyn, were you about to say something a second ago?
Well, I think that there's kind of, everybody is on a gradient or on a level. So it's like someone can be very, very sick, someone can be very, very well, but everybody is on this path. So you might see a person who's very well, but they'll have areas where there's a piece missing, maybe not total individuation. And then you may see someone who's very sick, but they have an area where there is a wellness in them. So I think it's really important to look at the person and say, where do they fit in on this continuum? So I think it's very tricky. I don't think anybody is really well. And I think most people are not that crazy. So
Right.
So even the people who are on the most disordered, they will have some normality to them. So I think it's very important to look at the individual. I remember, this is an example that I'll give you. I was teaching a class to a group of people who were considered, all have been diagnosed as mentally ill. And I was trying to teach them how to cook. Now, I'm not the best cook in the world. So one of them told me well afterwards, maybe years later, that she felt so sorry for me because she could tell I didn't know what I was doing, but she didn't want to embarrass me in front of the other people. So she would kind of guide me. So I was putting them in the place of maybe putting them as my children, and I'm trying to teach them. She's putting something on me. Maybe I'm her grandmother and she's trying to be kind. So I don't think it's a simple thing of well or ill. I think it's very, Jordan, you're nodding your head. I'd like to hear what you think, because I don't think it's a clear-cut matter. Why did you nod, Jordan?
I nod my head when you said well or ill it's not that black and white. And the way I look at it is we're each crazy our own ways. We were each born to see a different way. And part of the craziness is being stuffed into a mold in formative years instead of being allowed to run and get hurt and learn. Because to me, I grew up with there aren't any mistakes if you enact responsibility to utilize what the product was. So like, to me, mistakes are opportunities for learning. So rather than well or ill, and rather it not being that simple, I think we are each our own. And it's about navigating how we connect with each other by how clearly and honestly and unforgivingly we can navigate our inner world, so that we don't have chatter electrifying or providing static in situations that really is unnecessary because it's our projection. So that's not in my head. When you said it's not just well or ill, that intensely resonates with my perspective. If that clarifies why I was nodding.
Absolutely. Thank you.
No, I appreciate you asking. That's a well or ill is not all there is. Is a wonderful way to put it.
So, Beth, do you want to take paragraph 100?
Sure. Freud has shown in a little essay, and that says Leonardo da Vinci and a memory of his childhood, 1910, how Leonardo da Vinci was influenced in his later life by the fact that he had two mothers. The fact of the two mothers, or of a double descent, was real enough in Leonardo's case, but it plays a role in the lives of other artists as well. Benvenuto Cellini had this fantasy of a double descent. Generally speaking, it is a mythological motif. Many heroes in legend have two mothers. The fantasy does not arise from the actual fact that the heroes have two mothers. It is a widespread, quote, primordial, end of quote, image belonging not to the domain of personal memory, but to the secrets of the mental history of mankind.
Okay.
Could somebody elucidate on that a little bit? I'm not sure what that means.
I don't either. Thank you for asking.
Well, I
It's a
think
lot
that,
in myth. Go ahead, Skip.
yeah, I mean, myth comes from archetypal contents in our psyches, and so these are events that have happened to a lot of people. We happen to know about some famous ones like Leonardo, for example, but Leonardo actually had two mothers, and so not physical mothers, but I think this was common in Great Britain, for example, where upper class women would turn over their kids to the nanny or even the wet nurse, and that would be that. Call me when you're 6 or something, and we'll start to interact with you, but I don't want to be with you during your baby years. And so lots of people have sort of surrogate extra mothers, and even I remember having my mother had a black housekeeper that came and helped her when I was a very young child, and my father was away on deployment in Norfolk, and so this black woman used to come, and she and I remember she and I were very close. I mean, not that she displaced my mother at all, but she was like a mother to me. I couldn't differentiate at that age. Maybe I was 2 or 3 years old at the time, but there have been other cases. For example, when we were in Kodiak, when we were still living in the town, so we were literally living in a skid shack. This is a shack like they pull out onto a lake and do ice fishing from. That's the kind of place it was, and it was just this tiny little place, but the young wives of the young officers just made do in those days, and my mother had a dear friend who was beautiful. I still remember her name. I'm not going to say it. And a very handsome husband, young husband at the time. But I remember her hair was just amazing. It had this shine to it and so on. And she was always around our house with my mother for months at a time until, duty stations took us to different places. But she was sort of like a surrogate mother too, in a way. And so, I personally have many experiences of these projections that I can point to. Does anybody else recognize it? How about any of the women realizing that you had someone to sort of think of as a surrogate mother, even if your mother was perfectly fine and was there present all the time, but maybe a friend of hers or something?
Well, I did. I had my mother and my grandmother, and then an aunt that lived very close by who was like they say the good enough mother. So
Mhm.
my mother had her failures, my grandmother had her failures, but the good enough. But I'm trying to see how that fits in. What does it do in my projections? And I'm not clear how that fits into what he's talking about. Do they all blend into one, or are the different people, do they have different places in the collective unconscious?
Well, I no, I think we're talking about the personal unconscious at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
And-
that's what
and-
I'm seeing.
And
I can.
and I think there's just a very vague sense of the need to differentiate. Let's put it that way. In other words, when I was 4 years old, I didn't see the need to differentiate between this one woman who came to the skid shack and my mother. Okay, although I obviously knew that
Okay.
the woman who came to the skid shack didn't stay there overnight. She wasn't there in the evenings or for dinner, but she was often there during the day. And, they were living their lives. They were learning how to can salmon berries and other things like that.
Well, I'd like to speak to your question, Marilyn, too. From my perspective, that there are two scales, obviously the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. And I mean, personally, my parents were divorced when I was 6.5, 5 and 6.5-ish. And, my dad and stepmother were married by the time I was 8. So and my stepmother and I got along brilliantly. We still do. And my mom and I do also. So it wasn't a competition, but I had two strong mother figures. And then I look at this as your the personal unconscious scale, there's your biological mother. Well, then your own personal rite of passage at the end of adolescence or through adolescence, to me, is where the child becomes the parent of the man or the child becomes the parent of the woman. And I think those realizations are when we are drawing directly from divine feminine mother of the creative wellspring. So it's key to me that Freud said, Leonardo da Vinci was influenced in his later life. So in a mature capacity where he would have undergone those rites of passage already. And even though he did have a double descent, it would seem that one of them will be the scale of the biological mother. And then there's the nanny, that dual there. But then the larger one of his rites of passage, his drawing deeply from the creative wellspring, that had to be formative on him, just that direct intensity of influence. So that's, I think, my 2 cents on the two mothers. That one is from the creative wellspring, the bigger collective unconscious mother, capital M, Gaia kind of mother, and then the other, your actual mom. From my perspective.
I could be wrong in saying this, so I guess I'm just going to kind of broach it and then see if it maps onto what he says in the coming pages. But I'm pretty sure what he's trying to do with this is saying that, how to put this? that obviously, having two mothers would be an impossibility, but enough people have the experience of believing perhaps they have two mothers, that it's become an image of that experience. The archetype has been built up through that experience of so many people having two mothers, wherever the fathers were at that point in time. You had a mother and a godmother, a mother and a nurse, what have you, that kind of psychic architecture has been built up over time to the point that not only was it present by the time that Leonardo da Vinci was working and creating his works of art, but it was around long before then and persists even still today. And although obviously Leonardo da Vinci didn't have two mothers, he clearly felt the presence of that primordial image in his life, and he made several paintings about it as well.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah.
that's a good point, Nick, because the last line in paragraph 100, image belonging not to the domain of a personal memory, but to the secrets of the mental history of mankind. And it seems to me that last part, but to the memory that belongs to the secrets of the mental history of mankind, to me, that's an allusion to mythology. It's an allusion to the unconscious, to the collective unconscious. And an interesting, different double mother situation is Zeus and Ares, or Hercules and Ares. And, no wonder Hera would be really raging all the time, because Zeus would cheat in only the way a god could, where he would impregnate two women at one time, because the twins were born of two different mothers simultaneously. They each had their own womb, is one of the stories. But so that double mother too, from fraternal twins, is kind of, to me, an interesting sidebar possibility to include. It's not that one person had two mothers, but then two mothers created fraternal twins of the same birth.
Yes, biological impossibilities abound in mythology.
Right. And so, no reason Hera would be angry, because not only, did he have infidelity, it was like,
Well,
he did it in only the way a god could.
and also we need to understand that this is the way life was. I mean, father was always absent. This is a point that Robert Bly made in the men's movement in the 90s, that father was always absent. He was either out in the fields, or he was out doing some errand for the lord of the manor, whatever it was, or he was fighting a war. And so, there were a lot of women around. There was more than just a couple of women, although, probably everybody had at least two that interacted with him in some way, throughout early history, coming right up to modern times. I mean, childhood wasn't even invented until the 19th century, I guess, something like that. And before that, as soon as you could walk and hold a hoe, you were out in the fields with everybody else.
Yeah, I was going to say, instead of getting your little baby bicycle with training wheels, here's your tiny little plow. Now that you can walk,
Right.
Start pulling.
Yeah, something like that. And so, anyway, let's go on. Paragraph 101. There are present in every individual, besides his personal memories, the great primordial images, as Jacob Burckhardt once aptly called them, the inherited possibilities of human imagination as it was from time immemorial. The fact of this inheritance explains the truly amazing phenomenon that certain motifs from myths and legends repeat themselves the world over in identical forms. It also explains why it is that our mental patients can reproduce exactly the same images and associations that are known to us from the old texts. I give some examples of this in my book, Symbols of Transformation. In so doing, I do not by any means assert the inheritance of ideas, but only of the possibility of such ideas, which is something very different. Okay.
Hello.
Hi, Grandma.
Hi, sweetheart.
That makes a really good point, Skip, with because he's going into history, and in that sense, then knowing the symbols and the archetypes,
Mhm.
so you don't have to repeat them. You know, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. I think it applies to the psychology there, where by learning these archetypes, by learning the symbols, then you're not blindsided by them and terrified. They can be
Right.
just afraid, or, you know, they make you afraid. You can have fear. They can be just simply intense. But I think these knowing the archetypes, as he's saying throughout history, it just came to me that circle of if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. It seems to be the same with the unconscious. The more you know about it, the less you are prone to get blown off course, so to speak, internally.
Right. Right. Um,
Yeah, I think it's
well,
interesting too that I could be wrong in this, but the sense that I get when I've read in the past and now in this, when I read Jung talk about archetypes, is that he's rather ambivalent about the existence of archetypes. It's not like it's a happy proclamation that they exist. It's like these are kind of a problem in some sense.
yeah, they force us along. You know, I call them dry riverbeds, and so those dry riverbeds have a certain form that curves one way or another, or over certain rocks, etc. And when you put spirit into it in the form of water, I'm speaking metaphorically here. Let's say you put water into that dry riverbed, it's going to run on that dry riverbed. So, you know, the archetype of mother is, when you're a mother, you're really a mother, right? And you're going to be a mother for the rest of your life, no matter what happens in your life. And so, but there are enough examples of mothers, so it's quite diverse. Although we can still point to certain characteristics of the archetype of mother that apply to everyone. But you know, some archetypes didn't get that well developed as mother.
That's a really good visual, Skip, of a dry riverbed, because then in a sense it's an unseen river, but then when it fills, it goes of its own accord, its own way, naturally, as it was already formed, even though unseen. So that's a really interesting and clear, I think, visual story and metaphor of that. That's a nice one.
I also talk about records in a jukebox. Okay, archetypes are like records in a jukebox. Once you hit the buttons that play that one, it won't stop until it's done. Okay, in other words,
right.
If you hit the keys that bring out the mother archetype, by golly, you're going to be a mother for the rest of your life, no matter what. Okay, because the grooves in that record are so deeply worn that everybody can point to characteristics of mother in every culture of the world without fail, no problem. And you know, and then sometimes you get a little playthrough, like my experience of writing my novel, where you know, I just was possessed by this archetypal anima figure, and she wanted me to tell her story. And there was no stopping until it was done, until the story was out on the page. She wouldn't leave me alone. But when it was over, and the record went back into the jukebox.
There's one thing I want to add to, which I think might help to shed some light on perhaps one of the reasons why Jung might be ambivalent about the archetypes and their existence, is the fact that if you're going to talk about anything at such an abstracted and generalized level, so to include all of mothers, it has to be bipolar. It has to include both the complete end of the positive mother and the complete end of the negative mother as well. So you see Jungians often talk about like Someone has a positive mother complex, or someone has a negative mother complex, or the same with
Surely.
all of that stuff. True of all of the archetypes.
Right. And there are examples of many on both sides. And
That reminds me of even the notion of toxic positivity, which is the new buzz phrase for basically avoidance. But it's interesting because that's a good point, Nick, because there's a both and quality to any parent. They're both a capital M mentor and a capital T tormentor, and often at the same time. I mean, the parent referred in, I think the International Family Systems work, they refer to most parents as the mentor tormentor, one slash in between them. And that really resonates with me because then the light is founded, nestled in the dark, and the dark is given place by the light. I mean, so they work together, and instead of having, if you say they have only a positive or only a negative, I think that's when serious business gets going, that there's a problem. Because it's too unbalanced. It's always going to pendulum. If you try to get something off of one side, when it's overweighted, you end up going that much further across the balance point on the other side, and it just increases until it topples.
Yeah.
And so there's a balance point that's important, I think, there, that I think you've kind of insinuated.
There's an example of a balance point for mother where at one point you're the mother of a child, and at the next point you're the mother of a son. And there's a qualitative difference because I remember when I was in the 8th grade, my brother and I were doing something that was really irritating my sister. I can't really say what it was anymore, but my mother wanted to spank us. And her way of doing it was to slap our faces. And so she wound up for a really good slap. And as her hand was coming across, I just raised my arm like this with a fist, but I just raised my arm, and she nearly broke her arm on my arm. And, that was the sign that now she has a son, not a child.
Mm-hmm.
And she has to deal with him differently. And then there was another transition when I was separating from my first wife, and my mother called me into the living room, and she wanted to give me a good talking to about how getting back into the marriage. And I said, Mom, you're entirely out of line on this, and please stop it because I have to live my life, and I'm not going to live that way.
I think take an example of the same situation or a similar situation is to say that, what might be good parenting, and the same is true of both mothering and fathering, to an 8-year-old is not the same good parenting as it is to a 12-year-old, and especially not to then, if you're a good parent to a 14-year-old and then that kid moves out of the house, that same good parenting can then become a kind of possessive, weird thing. And all of that diversity has to be enclosed within whatever this archetype is, whether it be mother or father.
Well,
that's a good point, Nick, because my dad, I remember saying, I am not your friend. I am your dad. And when we are colleagues, we can begin that friendship. But until said point, go to your room. It's just like, that's just the why. The answer is only because. And so you make a good point that the evolution of the parenting goes with the evolution of the person. And at the point when they go non-Oedipal, they leave the nest, that's when the parent lets go in the sense to you're your own wings to fly. And there's still connection, but not, like you said, not that possessiveness, that's tricky toxic.
Yeah. Okay. Let's read on here. I'll take the next paragraph, 101. There are present in every individual, besides his personal memories, the great primordial images. I already read this, right?
Yeah.
Okay. 102. In this further stage of treatment, then, when fantasies are produced which no longer rest on personal memories, we have to do with the manifestations of a deeper layer of the unconscious, where the primordial images common to humanity lie sleeping. I have called these images or motifs archetypes. Also, dominance of the unconscious. For a further elucidation of the idea, I must refer the reader to the relevant literature, and the relevant literature is Symbols of Transformation and Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, and the commentary on The Secret of the Golden Flower. So when I can no longer say, I have this experience where my mother tried to slap me and I held my arm up, obviously that's in my personal knowledge, but there are some things that are deeper and they're probably more automatic, I would say.
I would agree, Skip. I think then too, and I mean, especially if I look at your case there, then that arm raised up when you're trying to get a job as an attorney coming back from Asia, you raised your arm up and went, okay, I'll create my own job. So I think there's a responsibility of self-protection there that is basically ducking or, moving out of the way, or like you did, blocking. So when you got into serious trouble, well, then you turned around and put your hand up and went, no, I'll make my own job. And so it feels that that's the direct line of that evolving, and that you putting your hand up was a conscious act of burgeoning responsibility.
Well, I mean, that was a reflex too.
Right, but it started instinctually. Right? I mean, that's arrows. That's your life force saying, I want to live. I don't want to get smacked in the face.
Right. Right.
But, I mean, and the next, that's your parent, when your parent can't take you over their knee anymore. Well, now intellect and reason and consciousness and understanding and love come in a whole different way.
And this raises the next issue in Jungian psychology, which is, whose life are you going to live? Are you going to live the life of a boss who tells you what to do all the time and is basically a surrogate father, or are you going to live your own life and be responsible, take responsibility for your own life?
So that's a good point too, with when do you need to raise your hand to yourself? I mean, when do you cross-check yourself to say, okay, enough, and next kind of thing, to switch gears?
Yeah, I mean,
I would answer that, Jordan. For me, it's right now, or as of November 22nd.
There's
always a process, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But within my family, and I'm holding back about the mother thing because, but I was the caregiver, and I continued to be a caregiver. And even though I was working on it in many ways, and I became the caregiver for my mother. I started as the caregiver for my mother, who was an alcoholic, but I later became even more the caregiver for my mother when she was, I guess, what you call a dry alcoholic in adulthood. And then with my father, my mother died many years ago, but with my father, we would kind of talk it out, that I wasn't going to take care of him because that's what his mother did for his grandfather. His father's father lived with them, and his mother died of a stroke, and her heart just couldn't take all that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the role of caregiver was something that was always out in the open, right? It was something that could be discussed.
Mm-hmm.
And the big break, which I could have talked about before November 22nd when my father died, and that he and I talked about often, and he talked about it with other people, was that when he became a little bit helpless, you might say, which is to say he had to live in Florida, he couldn't drive a car, had to make some decisions that had to do with his care. He was in an ICU, and he made a blanket, and actually I love that word for this, blanket apology. And he named the years when he had neglected me. And we both knew, I mean, that was in the ICU. So later when we discussed it, when he wasn't in the ICU, those years, which was most of my childhood, from age 5 to age maybe 25, something like that. I mean, it wasn't only childhood, it actually went into the beginnings of my career. And when he and I used to go out to lunch together when I was managing editor in a publishing house and he was working 2 blocks away as project manager for architectural projects. And then he stopped neglecting me. Right? Anyway, I think I said it. I mean, obviously, I'm in a state where these are things I can talk about. Just, it's just like turn on the faucet. There's all of it.
But you did that not
Yeah.
only to yourself,
Yeah.
but with the beautiful support of you connected with him too. So you weren't doing it alone,
Yes.
except it was yours. I mean,
Yes.
it's so it wasn't codependent. It was very much interdependent.
Oh yes, there was a lot of beauty in it. The thing that I'm pointing out though, and where I started talking, is that this is that moment that we were all just
Right.
described. When does this happen? It's not only because I went through the tarot deck with this group, which is extremely relevant under this quote unquote circumstances. Not only that I chose to see Jungian psychology, therapist from the Jung Institute, because my sister screamed at me and there was actually no explanation for it, except my impulse was to be caregiver. Oh, I need to take care of, right? Like petting a little pussycat, who's trying to scratch my eyes out. And the therapist just said, cease and desist. You don't have to do that anymore. My father had already told me that many, many years ago, but I was still acting on but it didn't come from my mother. Because my mother was the anti-caregiver. And it didn't come from my father, obviously, because when he began to realize it, he was able to sort of, not quite admit it, but, speak about it coherently. I was not a caregiver for you.
Well, you really bring up a big one for me. I've always been close to my dad, or I was always close to my dad.
Right.
But especially when I took the architecture and shut down my architecture firm and went to the architecture of well-being,
Right.
and tarot and astrology. Well, that didn't go over well, with him, he's a poet, Greek tragedy scholar, an international translator, and this tarot monkey business. And 1 year, several years after I had published my deck, he said, I have to say, I don't buy the tarot mumbo jumbo. He said, but this 78 card consistent art series with a contrapuntal card back, I'm like, wow, I love that word. And he goes, that's really impressive. That's a discipline and a ritual that has so much life in it. So at that point, okay, there's boom. He's actually come to the table. Well, the next summer we were visiting again, and that conversation started cycling through my mind. And I went, he came to the table last year. This has been 15 years of, don't bring it up, or it's a menacing conversation. And I stopped and I went, okay, how am I going to come to the table? And I went, okay, Dad, I get it. Let's put it in your context. Ancient Greece. You're the head senator in your nice flowing pressed white robe. And someone walks up and says, hey, whatever happened to little Geordie? Where did he go? And I said, and you know what you say? And he goes, I think you're about to tell me. And I said, you say, oh, he toddled off and created this little 40-mile town called Delphi, and they call him the Oracle. Maybe you heard of him. he started cackling. He brought it up for months. He's like, oh, maybe you heard of him. But what happened is when he came to the table, he gave me the opportunity to come to the table differently. And I laughed at the very next year. And maybe the funniest thing I ever gave him came right off the third part of this conversation. And so one of those, long form things. His only birthday present that year was a card. And it said, Dad, I thank you for giving me enough emotional baggage to comfortably go into a creative field, but not so much that I went into prostitution. So the same kind of, I really resonated with you saying those points. You know those points, and they're over years sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to bring our attention to, for them to know, we have Manuela here from Argentina, I think.
Yeah.
Pardon? Chile or
Yeah.
Argentina.
Yeah. Great to see you, Manuela.
Nice to see you, even if we can't remember what Latin American country you're from. I apologize for that.
Wasn't Manuela actually Argentinian, but living in California?
She's not living in California,
Okay.
so far as I know. But in any case, there's a word in the next paragraph that I want to cover, and that is transpersonal. Because I think that when Jung is talking about this in this book, which is relatively early in his writing, I don't think it's quite exactly what he came to later on. Now, here, he suggests that transpersonal relates to the collective unconscious. But I think later on, and if any of you know, pipe up. I think it later became the transpersonal became the switch between the unconscious, the God image, and the self.
That I looked at this a couple minutes before. I looked at the word transpersonal and I went, okay, Jordan, you know what it means. Go do it again. And it's interesting. I found a short article that had 9 different synonyms, which actually kind of track through Jung's evolution of the transpersonal. And it takes it just beyond the limits of personal identity. And the new buzzword now is psychosynthesis, but there was Gestalt, there was Jungian, there was psychodynamic, what we're doing here, depth psychology. There was psychoanalytic, which is used often a lot less, but then psychotherapeutic was a big one, because that reminded me of your quote that prior to this last century, the church was the society's psychotherapeutic event, whereas now we can provide our own. So it takes that depth psychology piece with, I think, transpersonal, honestly, beyond the limits of personal identity, but with a connection within that is transpersonal rather than going outward. It seems, from my perspective, for anyone else's 2 cents.
That's a good insight. So let's read this paragraph 103 and then continue the discussion. Annabelle, do you have the book? No? Okay.
I have the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying with me, but I don't have this book.
Okay, well, you're in the wrong.
I'll stick with
you're
that.
in the wrong section. Then my wife handles the Tibetan
That's
Book
right.
of Living and Dying.
Well, we'll have to read the Bhagavad Gita.
I'll take this one if that's okay.
Okay, go ahead, Nick.
Okay. This discovery is another step forward in our understanding. The recognition, that is, of 2 layers in the unconscious. We have to distinguish between a personal unconscious and an impersonal or transpersonal unconscious. We speak of the latter also as the collective unconscious, because it is detached from anything personal and is common to all men, since its content can be found everywhere, which is naturally not the case with the personal contents. The personal unconscious contains lost memories, painful ideas that are repressed, i.e. forgotten on purpose, subliminal perceptions, by which are meant sense perceptions that were not strong enough to reach consciousness, and finally, contents that are not yet ripe for consciousness. It corresponds to the figure of the shadow so frequently met with in dreams. Let's see, this next one's pretty short. Let's throw this one in as well. The primordial images are the most ancient and the most universal thought forms of humanity. They are as much feeling as thoughts. Indeed, they lead their own independent life rather in the manner of part souls, as can easily be seen in those philosophical or Gnostic systems which rely on perception of the unconscious as the source of knowledge. The idea of angels, archangels, principalities and powers in St. Paul, the archons of the Gnostics, the heavenly hierarchy of Dionysius the Areopagite, all come from the perception of the relative autonomy of the archetypes.
Right.
I'm not sure that I completely understand the question that you put just before.
Well, he's introduced another idea here, because he's talking about layers. All right, what I was saying before was, there's my unconscious, then there's the collective unconscious, and the transpersonal refers to my communicating out with others in the collective unconscious, whereas I think later on, when he's talking about transpersonal, he's talking about a vertical shift from the self to the ego and vice versa. And here he's talking about still another, which is there's he's delineating here. I think there are many more layers, but here he's delineating two layers. One is conscious, one is unconscious. And this unconscious also can communicate out to the collective.
Interesting. Of course, I could be wrong on this, but I've always just understood his use of transpersonal, impersonal, the objective psyche, and the collective unconscious to all just be the same thing. And I don't think he means transpersonal in the sense of there's some kind of vertical or horizontal communication with other aspects of the collective unconscious or anything like that. Like I said, I could be wrong, but that's just been my understanding thus far. And I think it would also be perhaps.
Well, he's definitely first and foremost and always talking about the individual. And so he's talking about layers in the individual and getting in communication with that God image part of you that is really driving your life. Okay, in other words, why have I been doing this for the last 6 years? Well, I don't have an explanation for it, but nonetheless, my self tells me to do it. Why am I part of this confluence for next summer? Well, I don't have a good explanation for it, but my self tells me to do it and that it's important. And I recognize that as my individual driving force. Okay, I don't, like Jesus Christ recognized it as the Father. Okay, when he felt pressed to do something, he would refer to Abba Yahweh or whatever. He would refer to God the Father, and the book that I'm currently reading, Liberating the Heart, again, because it's such a good book, by Lawrence Yaffe, spirituality and Jungian psychology, there he says that Jesus was calling out, his Father within, whereas, I've been misled by Christian education all my life to think that God is outside. And, it's only within the last week that I've learned that if you were a Franciscan, you were always thinking of God within, which I never heard that before. And one of my uncle was vice president of St. Francis College in New York, and was very definitely a Franciscan for the first 45 years of his life, or at least 30 of them. His mother dropped him and his brother off with the Franciscan brothers when they were 13 and 11, respectively. And it took him 30 years to escape. He finally did escape by taking a Fulbright fellowship, and so he could go outside his vows of poverty to take that fellowship. And when he did, he met my aunt and married her.
Well, Nick, I think you and Skip are bringing up two components of, I think, the same thing, especially with Jung, because if you read Jung, Skip's talking about the vertical component. The principalities and powers in St. Paul. That's the firmament. So that's that veil beyond which the unseen lives. So you go beyond that, i.e. into the unconscious. But footnote number 4, where he says the collective unconscious stands for the objective psyche, the personal unconscious for the subjective psyche. So he is making a distinction there, which is interesting because this is one of the first places he does. Because up to this point, I would be in total agreement with you that, he's just playing a round robin with these quaternity of things that are all just the unconscious.
No. I just want to throw in there that that's not what I said, nor necessarily what I meant. I said that I never said subjective psyche. I said that it seems to me that he uses objective psyche, collective unconscious, transpersonal unconscious, and the impersonal psyche, all is interchangeable for the collective unconscious.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And then that's the first part of footnote 4, which is exactly what you said. Yeah, exactly.
But that's not to say necessarily that, of course, I'm an authority on the topic or anything. I was not quite sure of the distinction that Skip was drawing our attention to. I just always understood all of those to just be an evolution in terms of the same idea, more or less the same notion.
Well, I think this is a very different idea from where he ended in this footnote, where he's saying the collective unconscious stands for the objective psyche. I don't think in the end he thought that at all. The objective psyche is your objective psyche.
It's confusing language, certainly, but he does this weird thing, and I've noticed it particularly in psychological types, where he uses the subject-object language a lot to talk about libido and typology and stuff like that.
Right.
But he never kind of goes into absolutism. And then later in his career, he lapses those categories into themselves with talking about the psychoid being the connection between the inner and the outer, the objective and the subjective. And then it's like, okay, when you think back on him using the term objective psyche, it's like, was he saying this all along? Is he saying there's a point at which the inner becomes the outer and the outer is also the inner and there's really no distinction?
Well, remember, he was always saying that the unconscious is really unconscious. It's not something that you're ever going to get at.
It's also funny too that I know that he drew some of his ideas, particularly the notion of the self, the individual self, and the collective self, from the concepts of Atman and Brahman.
Mm-hmm.
Also in a lot of Indian schools of thought or Eastern schools of thought, there's none of this talk of division between subject and object. They're one thing. That's a uniquely Western perspective.
Yeah.
So he very well could have been tinkering with that idea conceivably even from this point, very early in his career.
Yeah, I only raise this as something to reflect upon. I don't have a definitive answer. Okay.
Well, but you're right about
Personally.
that's not where he ended up, because here, like footnote 4, the collective unconscious stands for the objective psyche. If I stop right there, he's playing an absolutism game, but he's not going all the way in. Like you've brought up, Skip, that one of the later interviews in 57, I think, where when someone asked him if he believed in God, he said, I have no need of belief, which would be addressing, I have no need of the objective psyche. I have a deep knowing, where then his personal unconscious, subjective unconscious, and objective, they were all the same thing now. I mean, he was swimming the whole world rather than just trying to come at it. Because I think that just that quote, I don't have a need of belief, I have a deep knowing, to me encapsulates that all of these things at the point of where he came to them, which was very different than it was here in this writing.
Yeah. When you say, what he means by this was defined by Robert Heinlein in Stranger in a Strange Land as to grok, G-R-O-K.
Right.
And you need to look that up on the internet, Wikipedia, G-R-O-K, Wiki, G-R-O-K.
It's like one of the biggest slang terms there is these days. Right. Oh, I grok that.
Yeah, most people don't grok it when they say that, right?
Right.
And when I heard him say that the first time, which was about in 2005, I saw that video for the first time, and I said, I had this epiphany that said, oh, well, I know too. So now what do I know? Right. And it took me 10 years to work it out. It just wasn't that easy. Marilyn, do you look like you're bursting with something to say?
Well, it feels to me this is like Talmudic scholars, and we're looking so deeply into something, and I find it hard to follow it, because I think it doesn't matter.
Well, it doesn't matter, except well, it only matters if mental health matters. I mean, because the issue is, and I agree with you to a certain extent. I mean, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, right? Who cares, right? But at the same time,
how big's the pin?
Yeah, how big's the pin, and you get into all sorts of stuff, and who really cares, honestly? But who really cares if there's the Higgs boson or not? Mr. Higgs, Dr. Higgs probably does, and the people who built CERN to a 17-mile diameter or circumference linear accelerator, they probably care because their whole careers were on the line. But for the rest of us, who really cares about a Higgs boson, right?
Well, the reason I have a different version of the book than the rest of you have. So in my book, the word transpersonal is not even mentioned. That word. I don't have footnote 4 in my book. I have footnotes 1 and 2. Oh. So maybe he developed further along the line and the book was rewritten, or maybe I have a different translation. But so it's very hard for me to follow the detail at which
there definitely was an update, surely.
Okay. So, and then what I found also when I'm with psychologists, they don't go to this level of detail. They really don't. In my experience, I have not found psychologists who think this way.
Well, but
They-
you're talking about people who work with the DSM,
Yeah, they work with a different mindset.
right?
And so
and-
these things are not, I mean, it's important to know what the transpersonal is or what all these things are. But when people are going, when you're going to a therapist for treatment, they want to know what is the code to put down so they can be paid to bill you. If
sure,
you're in a hospital, they want to know what is the code so that billing can be done. So this is not the way that I think most therapists think. I think
You know,
they're
right.
That's a
because
great point, but then that also makes
Yeah.
the point that the DSM in America, not in Europe, is only an insurance coding manual and it's not a diagnostic tool.
That's right. It's exactly. I totally agree with that.
Right.
It's also about, like, I mean, this question of caring, or does it matter, or what is the significance or meaning of what we're talking about, whether it's angels dancing on the head of a pin or the inner life versus outer life notions of challenges or deities, or all of these areas we've touched on just now. And in my last 10 days, all of what we have just said, including the angels and including all the rest of it, is extremely apt, relevant, and actively part of what I'm processing. And I'll give you one little example of it, which I might have even spoken about here before, that because this was some months ago. I visited my father 3 times since my second vaccination in March, when he was quote unquote healthy, and then just one time on the sick bed, which did not last very long. And on one of those quote unquote healthy visits, he told me, and he asked me to bring over the map, the big atlas, so he could show me. And he told me that he had been taking walks with Jesus on a certain road in Israel, or in Palestine, actually, is the way he referred to it. And he visited there in 1949. That was a memory for him, a real memory for him. And this visiting with Jesus and the things that he and I talked about, the prophet Elijah, writings of Thomas Merton, various frameworks that we were familiar with, was very, very real. It was real for him in his.
No, it is real. I mean,
Yeah,
Jung
but
would say,
that code that you're talking about, right? His code, I guess you could call it, was that he had been diagnosed with dementia. And at the quote unquote end of his life, there was a moment when the care manager, this was a strictly bureaucratic person, said to me, we have these 2 codes. One is allow natural death, which is AND, and the other one is do not resuscitate, DNR. He was very much alive. They were considering him for dialysis machine, and they had not, the primary doctor had not said, we're at this point, but the hospital needed the code in their system and there needed to be a witness. So that's just to touch on that, angels, deities, and codes,
right.
the medical system, because we live in a real world.
Yeah. So let me go back
Or
and
quote, unquote.
challenge Marilyn a little bit.
Thank you.
It is the issue that, I mean, it seems to me that Jungian psychology is a compensation that's the paradoxical opposite of the DSM. And so if the DSM is the Bible, then why have you come here? Okay, but that isn't. I'm not challenging you, and not intending to challenge you on that way. But the issue is a issue of reflection and trying to understand. And I've been trying for, really actively for 20 years at least, to understand why we haven't gotten any of this into the public domain so it can be reflected upon. Because it has always seemed to me that if we reflected upon it, then we might not kill one another so frequently.
From my perspective, it feels that a lot of
Jordan, I asked Marilyn. Let's give Marilyn a chance to reply.
Well, I don't think the DSM is the Bible because, first place, it changes all the time. The Bible has been pretty constant. And also, I understand when they have these meetings, there are very big arguments in the meetings about how to define something.
Yes.
So I don't go by the DSM, but I'm looking at the way that when someone, there's one thing about how you treat somebody, but then there's another thing in what I would call the real world. It's not my world anymore because I've retired, but in the real world of trying to make a living, you have to have a code so that an insurance company will know if you get paid for that or not.
Understood.
So it's a separate thing. I studied with somebody who, I don't want to mention his name, but he said, you cannot define a human being by 3 letters or 6 letters. He said you need a minimum of a paragraph or 2 to try to define a human being. It's much too simplistic. And he said, so we have to go by what is the way that we can work in the world.
Right.
He said, but never believe those codes. He said, never think that they're real because they're not. It's just a name that you give something because that's the way the system works. If you want to get paid for the work you do, you have to do it, but never believe it. Never think it's true because it's going to change. And when medications are given, things change. So it's not, the DSM is definitely not a real thing as far as a lasting way of looking at human beings. And I don't know what the lasting way is. I really don't.
Well, I'm not.
I'm here because I'm trying to learn a different way of seeing things.
Right. And please understand, in this group, I am not trying to do any psychotherapy. And I am not trying to define what psychotherapy should be in any way, shape, or form. All I have ever intended to do here is to present Dr. Jung's work, because I think it's worth thinking about. I don't know the answer. I mean, at the end of Memory Streams Reflections, Dr. Jung said, it's not up to me to be sure that cherries grow on stalks. And I'm just impressed by what nature can do. And so all I am doing here is presenting these ideas, allowing us all to talk about them in the hope that there will be some, number one, who, for their own reasons, find help in it. And I have had many people say that they've found help, but also somewhere among you is the Messiah, in the tradition of the gift of the rabbi, which is I don't have the answer, but one of you does have the answer. And by that, I mean one of you and the YouTube audience too. And so, help the rest of us to see. And I think Dr. Jung, he spent his whole career trying to help people see things that they weren't seeing. And certainly he's helped me see lots of things about religion that I was not seeing before. And even though I've been exposed to many different religions over my lifetime and in a certain amount of depth, now I see what Dr. Edinger was talking about when he was asked, what does Dr. Jung's work have to do with religion? And he said, everything. Okay, I can see that now. I can, for my purposes, I've grokked it, but only for my purposes. I'm not ready to proselytize per se. I'm ready to talk about the way I take things. Some of the things he said, which is what I did yesterday. Let's talk about one other thing here now, which is, since we were talking about footnotes, there's a footnote about the shadow here, which is also quite interesting because it's weird and not where he ended up, I don't think. So it says, by shadow, I mean the negative side of the personality, the sum of all those unpleasant qualities we like to hide, together with the insufficiently developed functions and the contents of the personal unconscious. A comprehensive account is to be found in T. Wolfe, in Tony Wolfe's, it's in German, Erfahrung in die Grundlagen der komplexen Psychology. But I don't think this is where he ended on shadow. And certainly it's not where Colleen Kibert is now, where she's trying to bring up the pearls. The shadow isn't all the negative things. It's all the treasure that we haven't pulled up from our own psyches yet.
He says together with the insufficiently developed functions.
Yeah, and that's what Colleen is dealing with, the insufficiently developed functions, but she's trying to make the point through the creative process, which she has studied for decades, that we all have it. We all have creative capability that can be pulled out of us if we only go through her processes, which she has taught us. And I'm just a novice with respect to Colleen's processes, which we are going to introduce in part in our confluence next summer. But what I do know from those experiences working with her, particularly last fall and winter, is that I do find them very effective for me, pulling up things that I didn't know that I, if I had time to be the kind of artist that Colleen is, then I know I could do it. I know I could do it now. But
Yeah,
that isn't my art. My art is pulling people together and making things happen in a different way.
I think you're doing what she's saying. I mean, you pay the inner water bill to open the creative well, and you've certainly done that. But in like earlier, each of us in our own way, this is your way, and
Yeah, and I mean, if I could put choline in front of every human being in the world, I would do it, um, because what she teaches one to see is absolutely profound, and by see I mean see in the Grok sense, to deeply understand that we have a creative power within us, and that creative power can save the world. Okay. I mean, in my opinion. Yeah, go ahead, Marilyn.
Well, I want to say two things. The first is to Annabelle Lee. When I was working with Colleen and I lost my husband, we have been married for almost 60 years. And she said to me, I want you to get the American Book of the Dead. And then the next time I went to see Colleen, she had bought a copy for me. And she said, you must read this. It's called the American Book of the Dead. And it was very useful to me. So I just want to recommend it as something I found through Colleen. And it was very, very useful. The other thing is about the book that I have. As I look in the index, the word shadow is not even mentioned. It's not even in the index. So I think this book must have been a very early version. And maybe I will probably go ahead and get the version that you have, because if shadow isn't mentioned, it's a huge piece that's lacking. And a lot of the work that we did with Colleen had to do with the shadow, identifying your shadow. And as soon as you identify your shadow, it's the unseen part, then you get bigger, because now you have that part. And then what's the part that's unseen from that? So it just expands you more and more.
Yeah, there's quite a long entry in the index on shadow in this.
Yeah, so I need to get a new version of the book. Thank you for saying that. I really, so a big piece is missing from, and I will have it for next week. Thank you.
Okay.
Now, I really love that book is so different in that you can see Jung able to not stick to his crunchy laurels and sweep him off into the garden as compost and go, no, here's where we are now. And at the, reissue, rewrite, evolve it properly instead of just, looking for more typos. I mean, it's showing his evolution in his work instead of just being an editor.
Yeah, and that's what I've always observed is that if you're going to make some bald statement about Jung, anybody, I don't mean you, Jordan, I mean anyone is going to make some bald statement about Jung, you have to say, well, what is your reference? At what point in his career are you looking? Because he did change dramatically over the years. And, he said that the only one of his books that he would not rewrite is Answer to Job. Okay. He would rewrite all of his other books. And
your reference point concept there came up today on Facebook when someone was there was a quote by Jung, but then the woman who put the quote by Jung underneath it put, look at this, another entrapping control issue on what artists should do from someone who's not an artist. And I just put, have you read the Red Book? And her comment was, I've read the Red Book and it all talks about his theories. And I said, I think you read the Red Book study edition. Have you actually seen, and I just pasted one of the image with the ship and the dragon in the ocean, just pasted, have you seen this? Crickets. And then, no, I said, you're looking at him from outside. Go in, and he's very, and of course everyone else just comes in and making other comments, but she was using a reference point of the study book only with spare few if any pictures to actually say she had read the Red Book, and not understanding that the Red Book wasn't the Red Book study book. I mean, so that reference point's so key.
I didn't even know there was a Red Books study book.
Well, the little one that, the little paperback,
The readers,
the reader's edition. Yeah, that's it. The reader's edition, not the study book.
Oh, you're talking about the reader's edition of the Red Book.
Yeah, I think
Oh,
that's all she had
gosh.
read, and saying he's not an artist, he just wrote about it. And it's like, no,
No.
not at all.
Yeah. I mean, I got myself the Red Book, and then I went out and bought the reader's edition so I could mark it up because
I don't want to touch the Red Book.
yeah, the Red Book was so sacred I couldn't put a mark in it. And
so we're gonna keep reading, or are we just gonna have some conversation?
well, let's see, where are
Let's just
we?
keep being the Talmudic scholars.
Yeah,
I love that, Marilyn. I
Yeah,
love
that's
that,
it.
Marilyn.
That's a
That was
great way of
beautiful.
putting it.
If I could get a word edgewise here, I'd like to make a comment regarding the Talmudic scholars thing, because I
Okay.
took something quite different from that. And, I do think it's easy to kind of get caught up in the minutia of debating over, what Jung meant here and what he meant there and this and that. And, I equate it very much to kind of a lot of what people call philosophy now, which is really just kind of scholasticism, just debating over what Plato or Aristotle said at one point or another. But the thing, even though I tire very easily of that kind of thing, I still find it almost incumbent on me to kind of stay the course, even if I don't like it, because I think it's the intellectual inheritance of the West. So it's important to understand, and it's meaningful in that regard. And I think very much the same thing of kind of this understanding of the minutia of Jung. We can,
Well,
or we can count on those hairs of God,
yeah.
but I think it's somewhat important as well.
Yeah. So, Marilyn, one of the things that we took out of our trip to Aptos was that all of us felt renewed by the time that we were in Aptos. And maybe you even felt it, even though you weren't in our meetings, but just because you were at the one event that we were in, you might have even felt it then. And what came to my attention right then was this passage in Jaffe's book, and I'll send this to you because I have scanned it. But it's a discussion of the Pentecost, and well, let me just read this section to you, because it's really about how each one of us comes to a discussion like this with a different background, a different experience, and hoping for something different. And we can all take away from it what we need. And it seems to me, I'm just hypothesizing here at the moment, that what we are doing is opening the unconscious of people. And when they hear what we say, they hear what they need to hear. And it's healing and it's renewing. And so let me just read this passage, which I think is it's just one page. And so, individuation and the Holy Spirit, Pentecost. In Acts, we read, and the footnote is Acts 2, 1-4. In Acts, we read, when the day of Pentecost had come, and mind you, Pentecost is 40 days after the death of Christ. They were all together in one place, and suddenly a sound came from heaven like the rush of a mighty wind, and it filled all the house where they were sitting. And there appeared to them tongues as of fire, distributed and resting on each one of them. And they were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. The scriptural okay, that's the quote. Then he says, the scriptural narrative goes on to describe how a crowd, many of whom were foreigners, quickly gathered, and how each listener, this was the wonder of it, heard the apostle speaking in his own tongue, his or her own tongue. This story reminded me of an experience recounted by Gerhard Adler, how upon departing from a lecture of Jung's, he shared with friends his astonishment that in his talk, Jung seemed to be addressing Adler's precise concerns. To Adler's surprise, both his friends took exception, each claiming that their own personal, quite different preoccupations were what Jung had been addressing. I have heard and read similar accounts from other patients of Jung's in which he seemed to be speaking to the very essence of their concerns which they had not yet revealed to him. For instance, there are accounts of patients coming to their session prepared to discuss an important dream, but treated instead to an hour-long monologue from Jung. The amazing thing was that Jung's words seemed to be the highest degree relevant to their dream, and they departed feeling that no direct interpretation could have achieved more for their understanding of it. This seems to be what happens in the company of one who is speaking from the self, that is, out of a connection with God or out of his or her own wholeness. In the scriptural passage we are considering, Peter quotes the words of the prophet Joel in explanation of the phenomenon of speaking in tongues. Quote, and in the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Okay, it goes on, but the point is, it seems to me, and this is just my leap of my own personal leap of understanding, that what we took out of Optos and what people take out of these sessions that, are basically talk fests, and who knows why there are 18 people on YouTube simultaneously watching us right now, plus the 8 of us, so there's 26 people involved in this conversation right now. Why are any of them staying here? And it seems to me that maybe what is happening is that we are opening the unconscious, our unconscious, and we're pulling things up that are meaningful to each person in their own way. And it's not that every word of ours is golden, but somehow they strike us at a very deep level. That I don't know. I'll shut up. Please, others comment on what I've said.
I thought I was just here to read a book.
Well, I thought I was here to read a book,
of you.
but yeah,
Yep.
there's that logos. But thought I was just here to read a book, but I think he used the right word. When I come to these groups, I may have read this 10 times, but it's all new. And so there's a concept of the word you used recently, renewal. Just from, the 8 people, 7 other people, 8 people here, including me, the comments that get pulled in from YouTube. It re-enlivens and refreshes these texts, and I get more than just my single-minded perspective. I mean, I can be broad, but then that's still an island. And this, I think, brings connection and community. So I think if I drop down to one word, renewal is why I come. I mean, you guys all provide that.
And why did I go to church in my early 30s? The same thing, right? I mean, I guess I thought I was supposed to, as a young lawyer with a young family, I should become a deacon in the church, which I did, and so on. But the fundamental thing I got out of it, at that time was that I felt renewed.
Mhm.
I felt better. Okay. And I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. And the pastor was hopeless. Okay. He couldn't tell me anything. But what I know and remember clearly from that time, now almost, 45 years ago, is that when I left the service on Sunday morning, I felt renewed. Okay. I felt better. I felt like I had been in a kind of therapy session, and I didn't know why. And I think it's the reason that people keep going back to church, because as Jung said, the great religions, all of them are early forms of psychotherapy, basically. Does that surprise you, Marilyn?
No, I heard His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, a few years ago. And what he said is, we'll never solve the problems of the world until all the religious leaders get together and speak to each other. And I think every religion has something to add to the mix. We're looking for a way to open our hearts to each other in a loving and kind way. And so I follow any teaching that's useful to me. I think the Dalai Lama is amazing, and he's kind of saying what you're saying. It's using a slightly different vocabulary, but the thinking is the same.
Right. And I'm going to share the one Jungian quote that nails this exactly, which is this. And the title I gave to it, and the phrase in red I added, but otherwise, theologians and psychologists are in the same business. For thousands of years, the mind of man was worried about the sick soul, perhaps even earlier than it did about the sick body. The propitiation of gods, the perils of the soul and its salvation, these are not yesterday's problems. Religions are, the red is part of this quote, but I added the two words naturally evolved. Religions are naturally evolved psychotherapeutic systems in the truest sense of the word, and on the grandest scale. They express the whole range of the psychic problem in mighty images. They are the avowal and recognition of the soul, and at the same time, the revelation of the soul's nature. And that is found in volume 10 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, paragraph 367. Okay, so.
Well, thank you.
I mean, does that resonate with you?
A quick,
Pardon?
can I ask a question about, now that we're touching on the unconscious, I'm actually reading a book right now from Jung. It's called Man and His Symbols.
Yes.
I know you recommend that book just for somebody that's starting out with getting to know Jung's theory and stuff. So, from I'm just on the first chapter right now, and from what Jung is saying is that, religion sometimes comes from myth, right? Where it does come from myth, and I could be wrong, but that's the way I interpreted it, right? Mm-hmm. And now that we're touching on the collective unconscious, I'm just trying to see how the collective unconscious could be helpful, or how does it connect to psychology? How could it be therapeutic to others? Now, I know that Jung that there's archetypes involved, and archetypes have a lot to do with mythology, right?
Yes.
But I'm just trying to make that connection between how can, the archetypes be psychotherapeutic for an individual. Uh,
Okay, let me, I'm going to refer to another book, The New God Image by Edward Edinger, a study of Jung's key letters concerning the evolution of the Western God image, because it's going to be directly on point. And what the paragraph that's significant, there's in the back, he's created an appendix of the 14 letters, all of which I've read onto this YouTube channel, so you can find them. But he wrote a very long letter to the Reverend David Cox in 1959, I believe, or 57. And here's what he said. Although all this sounds as if it were a sort of theological speculation, it is in reality modern man's perplexity expressed in symbolic terms. It is the problem I so often had to deal with in treating the neuroses of intelligent patients. It can be expressed in more scientific, psychological language. For instance, instead of using the term God, you say unconscious. Instead of Christ, self. Instead of incarnation, integration of the unconscious. Instead of salvation or redemption, individuation. Instead of crucifixion or sacrifice on the cross, realization of the four functions or of wholeness. I think it is no disadvantage to religious tradition if we can see how far it coincides with psychological experience. On the contrary, it seems to me a most welcome aid in understanding religious traditions. And so in terms of God, the way I've been taking it is that the collective unconscious amounts to God, okay? And in the metaphysical greater sense of a God that applies to all of us, that's what the collective unconscious is. Our individual gods, our God image, is what guides each one of us to do what we do day by day. But in terms of the all-powerful, all-knowing God, if you accept, if you think about it for a bit, if you reflect on it, and you find that the collective is in fact causing the godlike decisions in our lives, then the sky's the limit, because that's what it is. In the end, and it's not that one, it's not that the red states have the right God or the blue states have the right God. God includes all of them. And so what we get is the admixture of everything together. And God gives us what we in effect ask for, because if we ask for trouble among the races, we'll get it. Okay. And we do get it. So I'm sorry, Christian, did I overtalk you? And
yeah, no, yeah, thank you so much for the explanation. I'm just trying, can you just give me a couple of examples of what a godlike decision is, coming from the unconscious, from the collective unconscious?
How about Hiroshima? How about the first atomic bomb at Alamogordo, and Oppenheimer actually quoting from the Bhagavad Gita, I am the maker and creator of worlds. Those are some pretty, those are decisions that were collectively made, whether we consciously knew it or not. Most Americans and most Germans and most Japanese did not consciously know that what they were creating, they were all trying to create the atom bomb. Okay, all of them. And what we have today is the fact that Oppenheimer won that race. So that think of that as the will of God. Okay, that is the will of God, that enough juice was put into our program versus the Nazi program or the Japanese program, that we ended up winning that race. And it doesn't mean that we're always right or that it was right, but nonetheless, humanity is now at the mercy and has, even before when Einstein wrote his equations, it was evident to physicists that there would be an explosion that would recreate the sun. Okay, that was obvious from the equations. And everybody could see those, for 20 years or so. And everybody was working on it. And it just so happens that the United States pulled it together. Now, the question is, can we now survive what we created? And that's a real question, because, so far, sensible human beings have not allowed nuclear weapons to be exploded more, but there have been many close calls, many. And so if they were used, that would be the will of God too. I mean, can you imagine if Iran and Saudi Arabia both get nuclear weapons and some not quite so evolved individual gets in control of them, what happens? Well, nuclear scientists tell us that if 23 of them are detonated, opinions differ, it could be 100, but if 23 of them are detonated, all life on Earth ends. Okay. Now, there may be certain people that have the attitude that, that's the way it should be, and that's God's will. Okay. But, so far, since Nagasaki, there hasn't been another nuclear detonation in warfare. And, however crazy Richard Nixon and Robert McNamara and all those people were, they didn't use nuclear weapons against Hanoi, and they could have easily. And if they had done, it would have let the genie out of the bottle then. And
That's a key point too, though, with the wording haven't been used in warfare. I think there have been 524 separate tests. And so, there's a silent contributory global thing going on there with nuclear winter in a way. I won't go all the way into that, but
right.
That's an affect. But you're correct, not in wartime, and it doesn't implement that impetus to play God. It's testing, which is different than actual utilizing it against somebody else.
Well, and we're using the technology for, nuclear power at a lower level. And, if people don't manage the nuclear power plants right, we see what what happens with Fukushima, and we see what happens with 3 Mile Island and so on. You know, we can, and what's the one in Russia?
Chernobyl.
Chernobyl. We see what happens. Okay, they didn't have nuclear explosions, but they sure had explosions. Certainly, they did in Fukushima, and so some very courageous people stopped those chain reactions, and it's happened at least one time, if not twice, on Russian submarines where an individual refused to carry out an order to fire. And it's happened at least a couple times in the U.S. We've lost a number of nuclear weapons that went in the ocean, and we haven't been able to recover. And so, you know, what protects us from the war game scenario? Well, I was very worried about that when I was an active Marine Corps Reserve officer. I was very worried about what happens, and you know, I brought it up at a major school, and this Army Major General said, "Well, we have a rule: we don't launch on warning." And so what that meant is that the United States will not launch a nuclear weapon based on thinking that we're under attack. We will only do it after nuclear detonations have happened in the United States. And so we won't do it based on a mistake of a computer. And you know, since I've known that, it's very comforting to know, but it doesn't mean we won't launch. It only means we won't launch thinking that we've been attacked because some computer says we have, and we haven't. So we can't be spoofed into it. Okay. That it actually had. You know, it has to be confirmed that it's happening, and then we would do something. But then what? We still have to have sensible people in charge of those activities. And so, you know, Christian, if that's not the will of God, I don't know what is. But you know, we're at the mercy of the combination of things that we've put together to protect us from our own technology. We can destroy ourselves, not only ourselves, but all life on Earth, and without a hell of a lot of trouble. You know, we have enough nuclear weapons now to destroy all life on Earth. I don't know, at least 100 times over, if not 1,000 times over. And so the people that have been entrusted with those weapons on all sides have, you know, held their water all these years. And let's pray that they continue to. You know, it's not only the Americans, but you know, if you look at the movie 13 Days, you see how it became an issue for JFK in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Curtis LeMay and some others wanted to attack. And oh my God, you know, what would have happened if we had done that? And so,
If I may, and I think that I'm glad you asked the question, Christian, and I appreciate that at length, Skip, because that I hadn't even gone to that example, and that's especially with Oppenheimer reading. You know, I am now destruction when he said that. On a lighter note, I'd say too, when you completely realize what you need to do, and it's not poking your head up above the stream, it's not turning upstream, you just live it. And where a point reasons are unreasonable and you don't need them. And in one single step, you change course like an emperor changing course, and the whole empire of you goes with it. So it's not a leap of faith, it's a single step. But it feels like I really appreciate it when you phrase, what's a godlike decision? And people I've known who've done that, when they do that, you just see them change. And you see the divinity return in a way that is amplified. And it feels to be I think a micro example of what Skip just said at a personal level, where you change your whole world in a single step, and it's outright.
Yeah, well, just look at the Kenosha shooter, Rittenhouse. He made a godlike decision, and it changed the world of 4 people, the 2 that he killed, the one that was severely injured, and himself. And right now he's getting all these wonderful attaboys, and he's getting offered internships on Capitol Hill, but that's not how his life is going to turn out, not at all. There's nobody that's going to forget what he did. His life has changed for the rest of his life. People will be talking about the decision of the jury, and they're going to be talking about his life, into his obituary, however old he lives. That's a godlike decision that he made, and he, unfortunately for him, he's a mini god. And there's a bigger God out there.
Thank you for the input. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, you're quite welcome, Christian, and thank you for asking. I guess we probably have had enough, and we lost Nick, so
He goes at time, he has a schedule. He has a discipline.
Yeah, well, I don't blame him. I sometimes get in trouble with Debbie also, but but she's lived with me long enough, so she knows just.
Well, I made a mark after paragraph 104 and marked my book, so I know where we stopped. So
I think it's before 104, isn't
it? There was the relative autonomy of the archetypes, I think, was the last. Angels, principalities, and powers. We talked about the next one will be we have found the object, which the libido. Paragraph 105, I think we read paragraph 104.
Okay. Well,
actually, yeah, because the idea of
we're
angels.
at least going to start on 104 next week.
That's fine. Yeah, just overlap segue.
Just to overlap. So anyway, thank you all for being here. And
thank you.
Marilyn,
thank you for the book recommendation. Thanks.
What was the book recommendation?
The American Book of the Dead, which seems to
that's Colleen and
It was
Marilyn's
Colleen.
recommendation.
She said you have to have this book, and then she got it for me to make sure that I had it.
Mhm.
So, and then I carried it out. I was living alone in my home, but there are parts that you have to read parts of it out loud, and I did it. And it felt very strange. It didn't feel terribly holy to me, but I thought if Colleen is saying it, there must be a reason. And it was very powerful for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, last year, November 16th, I my dog got a lethal injection, and I read the entire book, Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. So it's a book that's recently been kind of worked through. And so here I am in another November.
Well, that's the book that one time I was traveling back from Asia, and I received this fax from my wife, and she says that I found the one book that if I were ever stuck on a desert island, this is the one book I would want. And I would be happy with this book and nothing else. And
Yeah.
it was the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and notwithstanding the fact that the Rinpoche got in trouble 20 years later,
Yeah.
but notwithstanding that, the book itself is numinous, and
Yes.
it's helped many people. And
So then I will get that book. Thank you.
yeah, no, that'll be a
Yeah.
very good one also, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying.
Yeah, it's a very readable book. I mean, when I say that I read it through last year in November, that's an unusual thing for me to sit down and read a book. It's a banquet, it's a
Right.
great feast.
And Debbie never looked back. I mean, she's now she's not ordained, but she's done everything that one would do to become ordained in Tibetan Buddhism. And the last 8 weeks, every weekend day for the last 8 weeks, from 11 to 1, she's been in a teaching by a Tibetan master on the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Right.
And also the Flight of the Garuda, that was the other one that she did, that she's just completed. But I mean, she's doing that constantly. It's a very soulful place around here, I can tell you that. I'm hopeful that she will join us in the Confluence next summer. It depends on certain circumstances that we can't discuss, but we all have the human condition we have to face. And,
Yes. Well, part of my human condition that I didn't mention about my father and his death and all that, I think you might appreciate it. He served in the army, and we had the honor guard with the bugle and the flag and all that.
Good.
And what my father did in the army was he was an architect. So they sent him to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to help design and build facilities so they could do the great business of creating the tools to destroy the world.
Yep. That's what they did.
It's quite.
Yeah.
Well, there's the creation and the destruction at one time.
Exactly. That was his army service, right? Service in a, quite multi-layered meaning way.
Yeah. Well,
I will create so you can destroy. We both will have job security as long as we keep doing our job. I'm going to create something. Now destroy it.
Amazing.
Yeah. Well, Oppenheimer, karma was not good to Oppenheimer, I believe.
No.
As I recall.
My father talked about Oppenheimer a lot, and read numerous books on him and analyses of what was going on and stories of Oak Ridge. And I mean, it's a fascinating piece. You've often mentioned Los Alamos, right?
Yeah.
There's a great book. 109 East Palace, The Secret City of Los Alamos. And it's a biography of the whole process. And it goes into, it's written, the woman, I think, who wrote it, it's just brilliantly written. And I don't have my copy here, but it goes into then the later life, I think, politics too, where, I mean, McCarthy, et cetera. I mean, he just got ripped, but it was a political change. And then, you know, he ended up being caught in the ebb and the flow of society rather
Yeah.
than having the life anymore.
Right.
Well, that's what happens to lots of us. I mean,
Yeah.
Which just means beware of dangerous cello music if you're in the water. Dun-dun.
yeah, right. And
Well, my father was a cellist, so I'm not sure why you said that.
Oh, Jaws, the dun-dun. I'm like, oh, beware of
Oh, I
dun-dun.
see. Okay. Okay.
Beware, not cello music. I
That
love
was
cello.
gave me a little shiver there.
yeah,
No,
and-
I love cello music, but not dangerous cello music. It's like dun-dun. Like, that's dangerous music.
yeah,
Yeah, no, it was a huge transition in my father's life when he passed the cello to me and he said, sell this, I won't be playing it anymore, which was
Wow.
also at that pivot point of no more driving, big apology, you know, just this. There he stood on the mountain then, you know, spoke his
Wow.
truth.
little known fact that
Turned the corner, turned a
Little-
corner.
little known fact that Skip was a cellist at one point.
Ah,
Very briefly, my parents decided that they couldn't afford the lessons, so they just put the kibosh on it. But I tried. I did try. And so anyway, I like the cello very much.
yes.
It's besides the piano, it's one of my favorite instruments.
Yeah.
It's
So Mistel says, being witness of the Holy Spirit will unnerve the man living a false piety by artfully deceiving others for years and redeem the man skewed daily by one blatant lie. Yeah.
Mm.
We will, you know, today I would say I am convinced that all of the sacred books are true. Okay, but not only the Bible, but also the Bhagavad Gita and many other sacred texts that you know, they all ring true now to me. And so, you know, when somebody says every word of the Bible is true, yes, I can say, yes, I agree with that. But then I have to qualify it a little bit by saying that some of it is true on the other side, in the unconscious, and it emerges. So,
well, like in Maryland said too, with the Dalai Lama, when all the religious leaders get together, to me, it's not all pieces of a pie. It's a more than 7-layer dip. Without any one of them, the dip sucks. I mean, you don't want to put your chips in there, but with all of them together, you may have something.
Well, what I think the Dalai Lama meant was it's not a political solution.
Right.
It has to be in our heart, like the logos rather than the, I want to say the Lexus. It's not the Lexus, but the intellect. It's not the intellect. It's if people come with their hearts.
yeah,
I think
that's why this book is so important, called Liberating the Heart.
I'll save you there, Marilyn. You were trying to say Nexus, right? Not Lexus.
so. He came to this area a couple of times, central, I would say Central California, and he has a very big following here. I don't know what will happen when if he passes away at some point. He's not designating the next Dalai Lama, which is saying an awful lot. I think it's It's a very big concern that people have.
Hmm.
Well, I think that is a big concern in Buddhism, certainly.
Yeah.
You know, it used to be that I would think, well, he's got a long while to go, but then I realized now he's 86, I think.
Yeah, he
So-
just still looks like 60. I mean, late 50. I mean, he's so youthful. He's so spry with his humor too. I mean, he's a real trickster.
Yes, yeah.
He'll play jokes on interviewers that are just brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
he
well,
has fun, so he lives.
Yes.
so I have to excuse myself because I have another meeting I have to go to, believe it or
Oh.
not. I have one.
Thank you all very much.
Yeah,
you.
thank you all. Much
So,
appreciated.
Peace. And,
Thank you, everyone. All right.
Take care. See you next
Thank you.
week. I hope you got what you needed today, Annabelle, and every week.
I do every week. Thank you, Skip.
Good.
Thank you, Skip.
Take
Thank you.
care.